They packed their bags for a 2-month European vacation and left me alone in an empty house with nothing but a single crisp $100 bill on the kitchen counter. I was barely 13 years old. I survived that entire summer on tap water and stale clearance bakery bread while they sent glossy postcards from Paris. 2 decades passed without a single apology or explanation. Then last night they finally showed up at my front door, but they did not come alone. They brought the police. What happened next destroyed our family forever and forced them to face a reality they never saw coming. I am Abigail, 35 years old, and the self-made founder of an elite cybersecurity firm. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you believe karma never misses a deadline and that the truth always comes to light. It was supposed to be the crowning achievement of my professional career. I was hosting an exclusive high-profile launch party for my firm at my luxury estate in Westport, Connecticut. The evening air was crisp and salt-tinged, blowing in off the Long Island Sound and carrying the scent of autumn. Inside my home, the atmosphere was electric. Soft jazz played over the hidden surround sound system, blending seamlessly with the low hum of wealthy investors, tech executives, and state politicians networking over crystal glasses of expensive champagne. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres. I stood near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the manicured grounds, illuminated by soft amber lighting. I wore a tailored emerald green suit that commanded respect and perfectly reflected the confidence I had fought so hard to build. I had constructed this life brick by painstaking brick from absolutely nothing. Every piece of custom furniture, every abstract painting hanging on the pristine white walls, and every $1 million defense contract my company had secured was a testament to my survival. I was no longer the frightened, starving teenager they had thrown away like garbage. I was a powerhouse in the tech industry, and tonight was my victory lap. My chief technology officer, a brilliant man named David, raised his glass to toast our new government software contract. The grand living room grew quiet, and genuine smiles filled the faces of the people who respected my intellect and unyielding drive. Just as I raised my glass to reply, the heavy custom glass front doors of my estate burst open with a violent, resounding crash that echoed through the grand foyer. The elegant jazz music abruptly cut out as my private security detail scrambled toward the entrance. The sudden silence in the room was absolute and deafening. My affluent guests turned their heads in unison, their champagne glasses frozen in mid-air. I slowly lowered my glass and turned around, feeling a strange, icy calm wash over me. Marching through my front doors with unapologetic arrogance were 4 people I had completely cut out of my life years ago. My father, Richard, and my mother, Patricia, led the pack, stepping onto my imported marble floors as if they owned the place. Right behind them was my younger sister, Brittany, the eternal golden child, clutching her designer handbag like a shield of armor. Beside her walked her husband Jamal, an intensely arrogant corporate attorney who always believed he was the smartest, most important man in any room. But the sight of my estranged, toxic family was not what caused the collective gasp to ripple through my gathering of elite guests. It was the 2 fully uniformed police officers flanking them, with their hands resting intimidatingly on their heavy duty belts. The young officers stepped into the center of my massive living room, looking around at the sheer wealth and sophisticated crowd with obvious confusion. They clearly had expected a much different scene based on whatever lies my family had spun to get them here. Patricia immediately began her theatrical performance. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest and let out a dramatic, wounded sob, leaning heavily against Richard, as if the sheer sight of me standing there healthy and successful was breaking her fragile heart. Richard put on his best face of deep paternal concern, tightly gripping her shoulder and shaking his head sadly. Brittany smirked at me from behind them, her eyes darting greedily around my luxury home, calculating the value of my chandeliers and artwork. Then Jamal took control of the situation exactly as he always did. He stepped forward with a sickeningly confident stride, his expensive leather shoes clicking loudly against the stone floor. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and aggressively snapped open a thick manila folder, waving a large stack of legal documents in the air for all my prominent investors to see. Abigail. He projected his booming courtroom voice across my silent living room, ensuring every single guest could hear him clearly. The party is over. We are here to protect you from yourself because you are clearly no longer capable. He turned to the crowd of shocked executives and offered a perfectly practiced fake sympathetic smile. I sincerely apologize for the dramatic interruption, ladies and gentlemen, but my sister-in-law has been hiding a severe mental decline for quite some time now. It has reached a critical and highly dangerous breaking point tonight. This is a private family emergency, and we are simply trying to get her the psychiatric help she desperately needs. Loud gasps rippled through the sophisticated crowd. Some of my most conservative investors exchanged nervous glances, clearly unsettled by the sheer audacity of the accusation. David stepped forward to intervene, his face flushed with anger, but I held up a single hand, signaling him to stop. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply watched them dig their own graves. Jamal turned his attention back to me and raised the legal papers higher, stepping aggressively into my personal space. The court has granted full and immediate emergency conservatorship to your parents due to your documented psychological instability and erratic behavior. He tapped the thick stack of papers with a smug, triumphant grin, looking at me as if I were a wounded animal caught in his trap. We have the absolute legal authority to take over your medical decisions, your real estate property, and your company assets starting right this exact second. You need to pack a single bag and vacate these premises immediately before things get ugly, and we are forced to have these fine officers physically remove you from the property. The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air like a foul stench. He was standing in my house, a house I paid for with money I earned, threatening to strip away my entire identity and hand it over to the people who once treated my existence as a burden. The officers shifted uncomfortably, placing their hands near their radios, waiting for me to react. Brittany stepped up beside Jamal, folding her arms across her chest with a look of pure, unadulterated entitlement. "You heard him, Abigail," she chimed in, using that sweet, condescending tone she had perfected since childhood. "Just make it easy on everyone and go upstairs to pack. Mom and Dad are going to take over from here and handle your finances so you do not bankrupt yourself. You are sick and you need to be locked away in a facility where you cannot hurt anyone or ruin the family reputation anymore. We are doing this because we love you." I looked at the four of them standing there, bathed in the warm luxury of my success, trying to cast their dark shadows over my life one more time. They expected me to scream. They expected me to cry and beg the police officers for mercy in front of my peers. They wanted a public meltdown to validate their fabricated court order and secure their greedy grip on my millions. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne. The cool liquid coated my throat, giving me a moment to savor their impending destruction. I lowered the crystal glass and let a small, genuinely amused smile touch the corners of my mouth. I looked directly into Jamal's triumphant eyes and prepared to dismantle their pathetic illusion piece by piece. Jamal took another confident step forward, completely invading my personal space. He pulled a sleek silver pen from his tailored breast pocket and tapped it rhythmically against the clipboard holding the court documents. He began listing my assets with a sickening, greedy familiarity, projecting his voice so every wealthy investor and tech executive in the room could hear him. He claimed he had already filed the preliminary paperwork with my primary financial institutions. He declared that my personal investment portfolios, the deed to this Westport estate, the controlling shares of my cybersecurity firm, and even the titles to my vehicles were now under his direct legal administration as the appointed proxy for my parents. He spoke with the smooth, practiced cadence of a man who made a living out of intimidating people in boardrooms. "You have exactly 10 minutes, Jamal said, his voice dropping into a register dripping with faux sympathy and underlying malice. 10 minutes to go upstairs, pack a single overnight bag with basic necessities, and hand over your keys, your phone, and your security fobs. If you resist this transition, these officers are legally obligated to detain you for a mandatory psychiatric hold. Do not make this harder than it has to be, Abigail. We are trying to preserve your dignity. My mother, Patricia, stepped forward, dabbing the corners of her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She reached out a trembling hand as if to touch my arm, but stopped just short, playing the role of the terrified but endlessly loving mother to absolute perfection. "Please listen to him, honey," she whimpered, her voice cracking theatrically. "We just want you to get better. Your paranoia and these grandiose delusions have torn this family apart for too long. We cannot stand by and watch you destroy everything you have worked for." Brittany immediately chimed in, crossing her arms tightly over her designer blouse. She turned her attention to my chief technology officer, David, and the rest of my stunned guests. "All of you need to leave right now," Brittany announced, acting as if she were already the lady of the house. "This is a highly sensitive family matter. My sister is deeply unwell, and we need privacy to handle her breakdown." The two police officers shifted their weight uncomfortably, clearly sensing the heavy tension in the room, but bound by the official seal on the paperwork Jamal was holding. One of them, a young rookie who looked barely out of the police academy, rested his hand cautiously near his handcuffs. "Ma'am," he said, his voice tight with nervous authority, "we really need you to comply with the court order. We do not want to use force, but we will if you refuse to cooperate." I looked at the young officer, then back to Jamal, and finally to my parents. The sheer arrogance of their coordinated ambush was almost breathtaking. They truly believed they could just march into my fortress, wave a piece of paper signed by a sympathetic, easily manipulated judge, and instantly strip me of a multi-million-dollar empire. They expected my spirit to break. They expected me to revert to the frightened, voiceless child I used to be when living under their roof. I did not break down. I did not scream, throw my glass, or beg the officers for mercy. Instead, I slowly lifted my crystal glass to my lips and took a calm, measured sip of my sparkling water. The liquid was ice cold, grounding me entirely in the reality of the present moment. The silence in the massive living room stretched out thick and suffocating as everyone waited for my inevitable reaction. I deliberately lowered the glass and turned my gaze away from Jamal, bypassing my sister, and focused entirely on the woman who had given birth to me. "A conservatorship, Patricia," I asked, my voice echoing clearly and coldly across the grand room. I deliberately dropped the title of mother. She had forfeited the right to that word 2 decades ago. Patricia flinched visibly at the sound of her first name, her carefully constructed mask of fake tears faltering for a fraction of a second. "Is this your brilliant new strategy?" I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, my heels clicking sharply against the imported marble floor. "Because leaving me in an empty house with a crisp $100 bill for 2 months when I was 13 didn't quite kill me. What makes you think this will?" A collective audible gasp rippled through the crowd of my investors and colleagues standing behind me. The narrative my parents had just tried to spin about their loving concern collided violently with the ugly, undeniable truth I had just dropped into the center of the room. I kept my eyes locked on Patricia, watching the color drain entirely from her powdered face. "Do you remember that summer, Patricia, you and Richard packed your matching leather luggage, took your precious golden child Brittany, and flew to Paris for a 2-month vacation? You told the neighbors I was attending a prestigious sleepaway summer camp. In reality, you left a 13-year-old girl entirely alone with no emergency contacts, no groceries, and a single bill sitting on the kitchen island. You patted my head and told me to make it last." "Abigail, stop it right now!" Richard growled, his face flushing a dangerous, explosive shade of crimson. He stepped protectively in front of Patricia, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "Stop making up these insane, vicious lies. This is exactly why we are here. Your delusions are completely out of control. You are sick. I survived on clearance bakery bread and tap water." I continued, my voice deadpan and razor-sharp, completely ignoring his loud outburst. "I learned how to stretch a single dollar so far it practically snapped in half. I learned how to fix a blown fuse in the pitch dark, how to barricade the heavy wooden doors at night so I would feel safe, and how to accept the crushing reality that the people who were supposed to protect me were perfectly fine with letting me starve to death. I learned how to survive you. I paused, letting the heavy weight of my words sink into the silent room. The young police officer lowered his hand away from his handcuffs, his expression shifting from authoritative to deeply disturbed as he looked at my parents. So if you think waving a piece of paper in my face is going to intimidate me into handing over everything I have built with my own bare hands, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper, you are vastly underestimating the monster you created. Jamal scoffed loudly, attempting to violently rip the narrative back into his control. He stepped between me and my parents, waving the court documents dismissively. This is exactly the kind of paranoid schizophrenia the judge was warned about, Jamal declared, looking over his shoulder at the police officers. She is proving our point for us. She is inventing traumatic fantasies to justify her erratic hostility. Officers, please step in. She is refusing to vacate and becoming verbally aggressive. The rookie officer hesitated, looking uncertainly at his older partner. Ma'am. The older officer finally spoke up, his tone far less aggressive than before, but still bound by protocol. Regardless of family history, we have a mandate signed by a superior court judge. I am going to have to ask you to pack your things. I am not going anywhere, I replied, my tone shifting into a sharp, uncompromising register of pure authority that instantly stopped the officers in their tracks. And you, officer, need to do your job and actually read the legal document that man is waving around so proudly. I turned my attention squarely back to my brother-in-law. Jamal was still smirking, standing tall in his expensive suit, completely unaware that he had just walked blindly into a heavily armed trap of my own making. You are a corporate attorney, Jamal, I said, tilting my head slightly and letting a genuine smile of anticipation cross my face. You should know better than anyone that the devil is always in the details. You stand in my living room and loudly claim you have the absolute authority to freeze my corporate accounts and seize my estate. But in your desperate, greedy rush to steal my life's work, you made one massive, fatal miscalculation. Before Jamal could even process the warning I just handed him, Patricia lunged forward to seize control of the narrative. She was a master manipulator, and she knew exactly how dangerous my calm composure was to their carefully orchestrated ambush. If I did not look crazy, then their court order looked like exactly what it was, an act of malicious theft. Patricia let out a loud, dramatic wail that echoed off the high ceilings of my living room. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly before turning her tear-streaked face toward my group of stunned investors. Listen to her, Patricia cried out, her voice shaking with perfectly manufactured grief. Please listen to the terrible delusions she is spinning. She thinks everyone is out to get her. She thinks we are trying to steal her life, but she is the one who took everything from us. She has been deeply sick and paranoid for years, and we have tried so hard to protect her. Patricia took a staggering step forward, acting as though the sheer emotional weight of the situation was physically breaking her. She looked directly at my chief technology officer, David, and the group of executives standing behind him. She stole the seed money for this very company from our family savings, Patricia lied, her voice echoing with a sickening sincerity. My husband and I sacrificed our retirement to help her build this life, and the moment she became successful, her illness took over. She locked us out of her life. She stopped taking her medication. She has been siphoning family funds and hoarding wealth while her own father works himself to the bone. We are just trying to save our daughter before she destroys herself and everyone around her. The sheer magnitude of the lie was breathtaking. I had worked 3 jobs during college to pay my own tuition while they bought Brittany a brand new sports car. I had launched my cybersecurity firm from a tiny, damp basement apartment, eating cheap ramen noodles while they took luxury vacations. They had never given me a single dime. Yet standing in my home, Patricia was seamlessly rewriting history, portraying herself as the martyred mother of a dangerously unhinged thief. Murmurs erupted among the guests. Some of my newer clients shifted uncomfortably, clearly disturbed by the raw emotional display. Patricia was weaponizing a mother's tears and society's inherent desire to believe a grieving parent. Brittany saw the hesitation in the room and instantly recognized the opportunity to escalate the situation. She stepped out from behind Richard and walked directly up to the two police officers. She lowered her voice just enough to sound intimately concerned, but kept it loud enough for the officers and the closest guests to hear. "Officers, you need to be extremely careful right now," Brittany warned, wrapping her arms tightly around herself, as if she were terrified of me. When she gets backed into a corner and her delusions are challenged, she gets violently unpredictable. We did not want to put this in the court documents because we wanted to protect her dignity, but she physically attacked our mother just last month. She threw a heavy glass vase directly at her head. "Please, you cannot let her wander around this house freely. She might have weapons hidden here. You need to restrain her before she hurts one of these innocent guests or attacks you." The lie was so incredibly vile and delivered with such convincing terror that the atmosphere in the room instantly snapped from tense to actively dangerous. I had not seen or spoken to any of them in over 3 years, let alone thrown a vase at anyone, but the truth did not matter in this moment. All that mattered was the narrative they were feeding the authorities. Jamal stood back, observing his wife and mother-in-law execute their roles flawlessly. He let out a heavy theatrical sigh and looked at the older officer. "We tried to do this the easy way," Jamal said, shaking his head in mock defeat. "But you see how she is manipulating the situation. She is a master at deflecting. You have the judge's signature. For her own safety and the safety of everyone in this room, execute the order." The young rookie officer's eyes widened slightly as he processed Brittany's warning about my supposed violent history. His training clearly kicked in, prioritizing immediate threat containment over sorting out complex family dynamics. He unclipped the retention strap on his utility belt, resting his palm heavily against his handcuffs. The older officer, who had been holding on to a sliver of patience, finally hardened his expression. He stepped forward, closing the distance between us, until he was standing less than 2 feet away from me. "Ma'am, that is enough." The older officer barked, his voice devoid of any previous sympathy. "I am not going to ask you again. Put your glass down on the table right now. Keep your hands exactly where I can see them, and step away from the crowd." My security detail immediately surged forward, stepping between me and the approaching officers. Two of my men, broad-shouldered former military personnel, planted their feet firmly, silently challenging the police. The guests gasped, and several people near the back of the room instinctively took a step toward the exit, anticipating a physical brawl. "Stand down!" the rookie officer yelled, drawing his taser and pointing it directly at the chest of my lead security guard. "Interfere with a court-ordered mandate and you will all be placed under arrest for obstruction. Step aside right now." The tension in the room was a tightly coiled spring ready to snap. Richard smiled grimly, watching the police threaten my staff. Patricia continued to sob quietly into her hands, peeking through her fingers to watch her hostile takeover unfold. Brittany stood on her tiptoes, her eyes bright with malicious excitement, waiting to see the cold metal handcuffs clasp around my wrists. They had successfully weaponized the police against me, turning my own sanctuary into a trap. David, my CTO, broke from the crowd, his face pale with shock and fury. "You cannot do this," he yelled at the officers. "She is the CEO of a major defense contractor. She is not sick. These people are completely lying to you. Sir, step back or you will go to jail too," the older officer commanded, pulling his own handcuffs free. He looked directly into my eyes, his jaw set with uncompromising authority. "Abigail, you are entirely out of options. You are coming with us right now. You can either walk out of those front doors voluntarily, or I can put you on the ground and drag you out in cuffs in front of all your friends. The choice is yours, but you have exactly 5 seconds to decide." 5. 4. I stood completely still, the cold glass of sparkling water still resting in my hand. I looked at Jamal's victorious smirk, at Brittany's eager anticipation, and at the heavy metal handcuffs swaying in the officer's grip. The countdown continued, echoing loudly in the dead silence of my living room. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally broken the foundation of my life. I slowly lowered my glass, placing it onto a nearby silver tray with a soft, deliberate clink. I raised my hands slowly, palms facing outward, showing the officers I was not a physical threat. I kept my hands raised, palms facing outward, a universal gesture of peace that stood in stark contrast to the absolute warfare I was about to unleash. "I am fully cooperating," I told the older officer, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any panic. "But before you place me in handcuffs and drag me out of my own home, I think my brother-in-law has an announcement he is just dying to make." I turned my attention to Jamal. He had completely misinterpreted my raised hands as a sign of absolute defeat. A wide, victorious grin spread across his face, replacing the aggressive scowl he had worn since bursting through my front doors. He eagerly reached into his custom leather briefcase and pulled out a sleek silver tablet. He began tapping vigorously on the screen, his eyes gleaming with unrestrained greed. He wanted the audience to know exactly how powerful he was. "I am initiating a total freeze on all of Abigail's personal and corporate bank accounts immediately," Jamal announced to the room. He projected his voice so every single wealthy investor and tech executive could hear his triumph. "As the legally appointed proxy for her conservators, it is my strict fiduciary duty to protect her assets from her own destructive tendencies. I have already drafted the emergency legal notices to her primary financial institutions. By the time she is safely admitted to a psychiatric facility tonight, not a single dollar will be able to leave her accounts without my direct personal authorization. We are securing the company to ensure its stability during her indefinite absence." Patricia let out a loud, exaggerated sigh of relief and leaned her head heavily against Richard's shoulder. "Thank goodness," Patricia murmured loudly enough for the nearest investors to hear. "At least her life savings will be safe now. We can finally get her the help she needs without her squandering her future." Richard patted Patricia's hand, nodding in solemn agreement, playing the role of the burdened but responsible patriarch. Brittany smiled at me, a cold, calculated smirk that screamed total victory. She was already mentally spending my money. I could see it in her eyes as she looked around my luxurious living room, assessing the value of the custom chandeliers and the original artwork hanging on the walls. She thought she had finally won the lifelong competition she had waged against me. She thought she was finally going to get the ultimate prize without having to work a single day for it. But their celebration was entirely premature. I lowered my hands slowly and looked directly at the rookie officer who was still gripping his taser, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Officer," I said calmly, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "Before anyone touches me, I need you to perform one basic standard procedure. I need you to read the physical residential address listed on that court order." The older officer frowned, clearly annoyed by the delay, but his training dictated that he verify the documents before executing an arrest or a removal. The rookie looked down at the thick stack of paperwork in Jamal's hand. Jamal rolled his eyes heavily and shoved the document toward the young police officer with an arrogant scoff. "Go ahead," Jamal sneered. "Read it to her. Humor her delusions so we can finally get her packed up and out of here." The rookie officer cleared his throat and read the address aloud. It was an apartment building on the east side of Boston. It was the exact address of the tiny, damp basement apartment I had lived in 8 years ago when I first started my company. The young officer stopped reading and looked around the massive luxury estate in Westport, Connecticut, completely confused. He looked at the paperwork, then looked back up at the high vaulted ceilings and the expansive glass walls overlooking the Long Island Sound. "That is not the address of this property," the young officer stated, looking at his older partner with a deep frown. "This warrant is for a residence in Massachusetts." I smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that made Jamal's smug expression instantly falter. "No, officer. It is not." I agreed smoothly, my voice cutting through the silent room like a sharpened blade. "That is an outdated residential address from nearly a decade ago. Furthermore, you are currently standing in a property that is not owned by Abigail. This estate, the land it sits on, and every piece of furniture inside of it is legally owned and operated by an impenetrable LLC trust registered in Delaware. I am simply a tenant residing here. I paused, letting the heavy weight of that legal reality sink into Jamal's arrogant brain. That piece of paper you are waving around, Jamal, gives my parents emergency conservatorship over me personally at a completely incorrect jurisdiction. It gives them absolutely zero legal claim or access to this property. You are trying to evict a legal tenant from a property you do not own, and you are doing it with a warrant that is fundamentally flawed and geographically invalid. Which means, Jamal, you and my precious family are currently trespassing on private property. Jamal's face completely drained of color. He snatched the paperwork back from the police officer, his eyes frantically scanning the legal jargon he had blindly rushed through the court system. He had been so desperate to secure the conservatorship, so blinded by the millions of dollars he thought he was about to steal, that he had failed to do basic foundational due diligence on my real estate holdings. He assumed, because I lived in this massive house, I owned it under my own name. He assumed I was an amateur who kept my wealth out in the open. This is just a minor clerical error, Jamal stammered, his booming courtroom voice suddenly cracking with a sharp edge of panic. It does not matter. The judge granted full control of her financial assets and her business. I am still freezing the corporate accounts right now. He began tapping wildly on his tablet screen, desperately trying to execute the bank transfers and account locks he had prepared. His fingers trembled slightly as he hit the execute buttons, trying to salvage his master plan. I took another step forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing right in front of him. I could smell the expensive designer cologne he wore, a sharp contrast to the cold sweat suddenly breaking out on his forehead. I looked past him and made direct eye contact with my chief technology officer, David, who was standing in the crowd with a massive, knowing grin on his face. Good luck freezing my accounts, Jamal, I whispered softly, but clearly ensuring the police officers and my family caught every single word. My firm was acquired by a global defense contractor exactly 48 hours ago for $60 million. The ink on the contract is dry. The deal is officially closed and finalized. All corporate funds have already been routed into a secure offshore holding trust that requires dual biometric authentication and a full board of directors' approval to access. Jamal froze, his finger hovering over his tablet screen. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with sudden terrifying realization. I am just a salaried employee now, Jamal. I continued, delivering the final crushing blow to his illusion of control. I have no controlling shares for you to seize. I have no corporate accounts for you to freeze. I do not own this house, and I do not own the company anymore. You orchestrated this massive, elaborate ambush. You dragged the police here, and you humiliated yourselves in front of the most powerful people in this state, all to steal an empire that no longer exists on paper. You have jurisdiction over absolutely nothing. The silence in the room shifted from tense anticipation to absolute shock. The wealthy investors and tech executives who had been holding their breath suddenly erupted into quiet murmurs of disbelief and amusement. They understood exactly what I had done. I had outmaneuvered a seasoned corporate attorney using basic asset protection strategies. I had let him walk right into my home and declare war, only to reveal that he had brought his weapons to an empty battlefield. Richard let out a low, angry growl, stepping forward, as if he wanted to physically grab me again. His face was a dark, dangerous shade of purple. "You manipulative little brat!" Richard hissed, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "You think you are so smart? You think you can hide your money from us after everything we did for you?" Patricia dropped her crying act instantly. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, bitter fury. She glared at me with a hatred so deep it practically radiated off her skin. "You owe us!" Patricia spat, her voice vicious and cold. "We are your family. You belong to us." The older police officer stepped between us, holding his hand up to stop Richard from advancing any further. The officer's demeanor had completely changed. He looked at Jamal's useless tablet and the flawed court document with obvious disgust. He realized he had been dragged into a messy, fraudulent family dispute, and used as a pawn to intimidate a woman who was clearly not experiencing a mental health crisis. "Sir," the older officer said to Jamal, his voice dropping into a stern, authoritative tone. "If this property is owned by a trust, and you do not have documents authorizing you to act on behalf of that trust, you need to leave, right now. You cannot execute an eviction here." Jamal opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. His arrogant facade was crumbling rapidly. He looked at his tablet screen, which was displaying error messages from the banking institutions, denying his unauthorized access requests. His master plan to seize my wealth had just evaporated into thin air, leaving him standing in my living room, looking like an absolute fool. Brittany grabbed Jamal's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. "What is she talking about?" "Jamal," Brittany demanded, her voice shrill and panicky. "Do something. You said this was guaranteed. You said we were going to control everything tonight. Fix it right now." But Jamal could not fix it. He was completely powerless, and he knew it. And the best part was that my revenge had not even truly begun. This was just the warm-up. The realization that millions of dollars had just slipped entirely out of his reach finally shattered whatever remained of my father's fragile self-control. The concerned parent act he had been playing for the crowd evaporated in a single terrifying instant. Richard's face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The dark purple flush on his neck crept up to his cheeks, and the veins in his forehead bulged as he stared at me. For my entire childhood, that specific look had been the precursor to slammed doors, shattered plates, and endless screaming matches that I had to hide from in my bedroom closet. But I was not a child hiding in a closet anymore. He shoved past Jamal with such sudden, violent force that my brother-in-law stumbled backward into Brittany. Before the older police officer could react or step between us, Richard lunged at me. His heavy, calloused hand clamped down on my left bicep like a steel vise. His fingers dug painfully into my skin through the thick fabric of my tailored emerald suit jacket. The sheer force of his grip physically jolted my entire body forward. Several of my investors gasped in horror, and someone near the back of the room let out a sharp, terrified scream. "You ungrateful little wretch!" Richard roared, his voice tearing through the elegant living room with explosive volume. Specks of his spit flew through the air as he leaned his face inches from mine. "You think you can just write us off and play these corporate games with us? You think you can hoard all of this wealth, live in a glass mansion, and act like you are better than the people who raised you?" I did not flinch. I kept my eyes locked onto his, watching the absolute desperation burning in his pupils. He shook my arm violently, trying to physically dominate me, the way he always had when words failed him. "We gave you life," Richard screamed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You owe us everything. Every single dollar you have, every ounce of success you built, it belongs to this family by right. You would be absolutely nothing without us. I will not let you walk away with our money. I will drag you out of this house by your hair if I have to." The sheer entitlement of his words hung in the air, a vile testament to how he truly viewed me. I was not a daughter to him. I was an investment property he felt he had been unfairly denied the returns on. Before I could even attempt to pull my arm away from his crushing grip, a blur of motion swept past my peripheral vision. Carter, my lead security specialist, and a man with 15 years of elite military experience, moved with terrifying precision. He did not ask Richard to let go. He did not issue a verbal warning. Carter simply stepped forward, grabbed Richard by the collar of his expensive dress shirt and the belt of his trousers, and physically ripped my father away from me. The sudden, brutal separation sent Richard flying backward. His heavy leather shoes slipped on the polished marble floor, and he crashed hard against a nearby glass coffee table. The thick glass shuddered under the impact of his weight, and a silver tray of champagne flutes shattered onto the floor, sending crystal shards scattering across the room. The instantaneous violence flipped a dangerous switch in the room. The young rookie police officer, who had already been highly agitated by Brittany's lies about my violent tendencies, completely panicked. He saw a massive man in a dark suit throw an older man across the room, and his training kicked into overdrive. "Police, drop to the ground right now!" the rookie officer screamed, pulling his bright yellow taser from its holster and leveling it directly at Carter's chest. The twin red laser sights danced aggressively across my security guard's dark jacket. The older officer immediately drew his own taser, shouting conflicting orders as the chaos escalated. "Everyone freeze, step away from each other right now," the older officer commanded, his eyes darting frantically between Carter Jamal, who was backing away with his hands raised, and Richard, who was groaning on the floor amidst the broken glass. Patricia shrieked hysterically, dropping to her knees beside Richard. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders, glaring up at Carter and then at me. "They are trying to kill us!" Patricia sobbed loudly, pointing a shaking finger at my security team. "I told you she was violent. I told you she was dangerous. Arrest her. Arrest all of them." Brittany was pressed flat against the wall, her eyes wide with genuine shock. The sophisticated corporate takeover she had envisioned had devolved into a physical brawl and a potential police shootout in a matter of seconds. Carter stood his ground, placing his large body entirely between the police officers and me. He kept his hands open and visible at his sides, refusing to drop to the floor, but making no aggressive moves toward the cops. "Sir, I am the private security detail for this estate," Carter announced, his voice remarkably calm despite the tasers pointed at his chest. "That man just physically assaulted my client in her own home. I neutralized an active threat. I am unarmed and I am fully cooperating." The tension in the living room was at an absolute boiling point. The air felt thick and heavy, charged with the hum of the drawn tasers and the panicked breathing of my guests. My investors and colleagues were clustered together near the far wall, completely paralyzed by the unfolding nightmare. One wrong move, one sudden twitch from anyone in the room, and the officers were going to deploy their weapons. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my racing heart to steady. I could still feel the painful throbbing in my arm, where Richard had grabbed me, a dull ache that grounded me in the reality of what I needed to do next. I had to regain complete control of the room before my security team was arrested or someone was severely injured. "Carter, stand down." I commanded, my voice cutting sharply through the shouting and the crying. "Step aside. Let the officers do their job." Carter hesitated for a fraction of a second, his protective instincts warring with my direct order. But he knew exactly who signed his paychecks. He slowly lowered his stance and took a deliberate step to the right, clearing the line of sight between me and the police officers. I stepped forward, crunching a piece of broken crystal beneath the heel of my shoe. I looked directly at the older police officer, who was slowly lowering his taser, but keeping it firmly gripped in his hand. "Officer," I said, projecting my voice so the entire room could hear the absolute calm in my tone. "You were called here to execute a civil conservatorship order. An order that your own partner just confirmed lists the incorrect address and targets assets I no longer own. You arrived for a civil standby. Instead, you just witnessed a grown man physically assault a woman in front of 40 reliable witnesses." I slowly pulled up the sleeve of my emerald suit jacket, revealing my pale skin. A dark, angry red mark was already blooming across my bicep, exactly in the shape of Richard's fingers. I held my arm up, letting the stark physical evidence of his violence speak for itself. "My father did not come here to protect me," I stated coldly, looking down at Richard, who was struggling to sit up while Patricia desperately brushed the broken glass off his suit. "He came here to steal from me." And when he realized I had outsmarted his little legal trap, he resorted to the only tactic he actually knows: physical intimidation. The older officer looked at the bruising on my arm, then looked down at the shattered coffee table and my father. The narrative Patricia and Jamal had so carefully constructed was rapidly falling apart right in front of the police. They were no longer the concerned, loving family trying to save a sick relative. They looked exactly like what they were: desperate, angry criminals who had just lost their final gamble. I do not want my security team defending me anymore. I continued, turning my gaze back to the officers. I want to press formal criminal charges against Richard for assault and battery. I want him removed from my property immediately. Jamal finally found his voice, stepping out from behind his wife. You cannot do that, Jamal stammered, trying to regain his authoritative posture. You are under a legal conservatorship. You do not have the legal capacity to press charges or direct the police. We speak for you. Officer, execute the psychiatric hold. She is clearly a danger to this family. But the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. The older officer holstered his taser with a sharp click and let out a long, exhausted breath. He looked at Jamal with a mixture of pity and deep professional annoyance. Counselor, the officer said, his tone dripping with disdain. I am not a lawyer, but I have been wearing this badge long enough to know when I am being played. You brought us here under the guise of a peaceful medical transition. Instead, you have no jurisdiction, the paperwork is flawed, and your client just assaulted the homeowner in front of us. I am not executing a psychiatric hold on a woman who is standing there calmly asking to press assault charges. Richard pushed Patricia away and scrambled awkwardly to his feet, his face still purple with rage. He swayed slightly, glaring at the officer. You are going to listen to her over us, Richard spat out, pointing an accusing finger at me. She is a liar. She set this whole thing up. Before Richard could launch into another unhinged tirade, a new voice echoed from the grand foyer, cutting through the tension like a physical blow. What the hell is taking so long in here? The deep, gravelly voice demanded. The heavy footsteps echoed against the marble floor, approaching the living room at a rapid, commanding pace. The two young police officers immediately stiffened, turning toward the archway with looks of sudden, profound respect. A senior police officer walked into the room. He wore a crisp white shirt, adorned with the gold brass of a precinct captain. His hair was silver at the temples, and his face was lined with decades of hard experience on the force. He surveyed the chaotic scene, the broken glass, the drawn tasers, the terrified wealthy guests, and my trembling, furious family. Then the captain's eyes locked onto me. He stopped dead in his tracks. I recognized him instantly. The silver hair and the wrinkles were new, but the shape of his jaw and the sharp, observant blue eyes were exactly the same. It was him. It was the exact same cop who had knocked on my front door 21 years ago. The heavy silence in the room was absolute as Captain Donovan stepped fully into the light of the crystal chandeliers. He did not look like a man who was easily impressed or easily intimidated. His uniform was immaculate, and his posture radiated the kind of hardened authority that only comes from decades of walking into the worst situations human beings can create. The two younger officers immediately snapped to attention, their previous panic evaporating under the weight of his command presence. The rookie officer fumbled slightly as he double-checked that his taser was fully secured in its holster, while the older officer let out a visible breath of relief. Captain Donovan slowly swept his gaze across the wreckage of my living room. He looked at the shattered glass of the coffee table, glittering violently on the imported marble floor. He looked at my security specialist Carter, who was still standing tall and unbothered with his hands visible. He looked at Jamal, whose designer suit was suddenly looking very wrinkled, and whose confident legal posture had completely collapsed. He looked at Brittany, who was practically trying to merge with the wall, and then he looked down at Richard and Patricia. My father was still sitting on the floor, rubbing his lower back, and glaring up at the police with a mixture of fear and lingering rage. Patricia was kneeling next to him, her fake tears having completely dried up, leaving only a look of bitter, calculating panic on her face. What exactly is going on here? Captain Donovan asked, his voice low and dangerous. I sent 2 units for a standard 10-minute civil standby. I walk in and find drawn weapons, a shattered table, and a crowd of terrified civilians. Somebody give me a straight answer before I start handing out obstruction charges to everyone in this room. The older officer stepped forward immediately, snapping a crisp salute. Captain, we responded to a request for a civil standby to enforce an emergency medical conservatorship, but the situation on the ground is entirely non-compliant with the paperwork. The proxy acting for the conservators, the man in the gray suit, is attempting to seize corporate assets and real estate that do not belong to the subject. The address on the warrant is decades out of date. Furthermore, the subject's father, the man on the floor, just committed an unprovoked physical assault against the subject in front of dozens of witnesses. Captain Donovan's eyes narrowed. He held out his hand, and the older officer immediately handed over the thick manila folder Jamal had been waving around so triumphantly just minutes earlier. The captain flipped open the file, his eyes scanning the legal jargon with the speed of a man who spent half his life reading court orders. He let out a harsh, humorless scoff and slapped the folder shut. Jamal, desperate to salvage his completely ruined master plan, stepped forward. He tried to puff out his chest and project the booming courtroom voice he had used to intimidate the younger cops, but his voice wavered under the captain's icy stare. "Captain, my name is Jamal, and I am a senior corporate attorney representing the conservators," Jamal said, attempting to sound like a colleague rather than a suspect. "That paperwork is signed by a superior court judge. My sister-in-law is suffering from a severe psychotic break. She ordered her private security thug to attack my father-in-law. We are the victims here. You need to execute the psychiatric hold immediately before she hurts someone else." Captain Donovan slowly turned his head to look at Jamal. He looked at him as if he were a particularly disgusting bug that had just crawled onto his shoe. Counselor Donovan said, his voice devoid of any respect, "You brought my officers into a private residence under false pretenses with geographically invalid paperwork to execute what looks exactly like a hostile financial takeover. And now, you are standing in a pile of broken glass trying to tell me how to do my job while your client sits on the floor after assaulting the homeowner. If you speak to me in that tone again, I will have you arrested for filing a false police report and conspiracy to commit fraud. Do you understand me?" Jamal's mouth snapped shut. He swallowed hard, taking a slow step backward and raising his hands in a gesture of absolute surrender. Brittany let out a tiny, terrified whimper, realizing that her husband, the man who promised her millions of dollars tonight, was completely powerless to protect them. Captain Donovan turned away from the pathetic sight of my brother-in-law and finally looked directly at me. For the first time since he walked into the room, the hard edge of his expression softened into a look of sharp, analytical curiosity. He looked at my tailored emerald suit, at the expensive jewelry resting against my collarbone, and at the massive luxury estate surrounding me. He looked at the bruise already forming on my arm where Richard had grabbed me. Then he looked directly into my eyes. I did not break eye contact. I let him look. I saw the gears turning in his head as he stared at my face. He was searching for something familiar, pulling up mental files from thousands of cases over a 20-year career. I could see the exact moment the memory hit him. His pupils dilated slightly, and his jaw tightened. He took a sudden sharp breath, stepping closer to me as if he could not believe what he was seeing. The memory was rushing back to him in vivid detail. I knew it was because the same memory was playing in my own mind. 21 years ago, it had been a freezing torrential rainstorm. He had been a rookie cop assigned to perform a wellness check after a neighbor reported a dog barking uncontrollably for days. Instead of a dog, he found a terrified, freezing 13-year-old girl huddled under a thin blanket in a dark house with no electricity and no food. He was the one who wrapped his heavy wool jacket around my shivering shoulders. He was the one who shone his heavy metal flashlight into the empty kitchen cupboards. And he was the one who had to stand there and listen to my parents lie their way out of child abandonment charges when they finally flew back from Paris. Donovan slowly turned his head, his gaze dragging away from me to look down at Richard and Patricia. The confusion in his eyes was instantly replaced by a look of profound, absolute disgust. He stepped toward them, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the broken crystal. Richard and Patricia Donovan said their names, tasting like poison in his mouth. Patricia flinched violently at the sound of his voice. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with sudden terror. She did not recognize his face immediately, but she absolutely recognized the tone of a police officer who knew exactly what kind of monster she was hiding beneath her expensive clothes. Richard scrambled backward on the floor, trying to put distance between himself and the captain. "You do not remember me, do you?" Donovan asked, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. He leaned over them, resting his hands on his duty belt. I had a lot less gray hair and a lot less brass on my collar. "But I remember you. I remember both of you perfectly. You were the couple who went on a luxury vacation to Europe and told the responding officer that your teenage daughter was supposed to be at a summer camp and must have run away to sneak back into the house." Richard's face, drained of the angry purple flush, replaced instantly by a sickly, terrified pale white. He opened his mouth to speak, but he was completely paralyzed by the sudden, horrifying exposure of his darkest secret. Patricia clamped her hands over her mouth, a strangled sob escaping her throat, as the carefully constructed illusion of her perfect motherhood was entirely annihilated. Jamal and Brittany stared at my parents in absolute shock. They had clearly never been told the true story of that summer. They had bought the lie that I was just a difficult, rebellious teenager who caused trouble for my loving parents. Now standing in my living room, the golden child and her arrogant husband were finally hearing the monstrous truth from a precinct captain. "You lied to me 21 years ago?" Donovan continued, his voice echoing loudly in the silent room. "You stood in that freezing kitchen looking at your starving daughter, and you lied to my face to save yourselves from going to a federal prison. I was a rookie. I did not have the authority to tear your story apart, and Child Protective Services failed her. It has eaten at me for 2 decades." Captain Donovan stood up straight, turning his back on my pathetic parents and looking directly at me. The respect in his eyes was absolute. He was looking at a survivor. He was looking at a woman who had taken the worst hand a child could be dealt and used it to build an impenetrable fortress. "Ma'am," Donovan said, his voice formal and completely steady, "my officers informed me that you wish to press formal criminal charges against this man for assault and battery." I nodded slowly, feeling a deep, powerful warmth spread through my chest. The terrified, helpless 13-year-old girl inside of me finally felt safe. "Yes, Captain Donovan," I said clearly, ensuring every single person in the room heard me. "I want to press full charges. I want him arrested, and I am not finished." I turned my attention back to Jamal, who was currently sweating profusely and desperately clutching his useless tablet. I promised Jamal a proper show. I said, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. And I always deliver on my promises. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small, sleek remote control. I pointed it toward the far wall of the living room where a massive state-of-the-art presentation screen was hidden behind custom wood paneling. "It is time to show everyone exactly why my family was so desperate to seize my assets tonight. It is time to talk about the stolen money." Richard's face went completely pale. The mention of stolen money struck a nerve so deep, his entire demeanor shifted from aggressive entitlement to desperate self-preservation. He scrambled to his feet, completely ignoring the broken glass crunching beneath his shoes. He did not lunge toward me this time. Instead, he moved directly toward Captain Donovan, raising his hands in a frantic, pleading gesture, trying to rebuild the illusion I was rapidly tearing down. "Officer, my daughter is having a psychotic break," Richard yelled, his voice cracking with artificial panic. "Do you see this behavior? She is pulling out remote controls and threatening us with paranoid delusions in the middle of a medical intervention. She is completely detached from reality. And whatever you think you remember from 21 years ago, you are deeply mistaken. She was a severely troubled teenager who ran away from a prestigious summer camp to spite us. We were terrified parents trying to do our best. She is just using a closed child services case to manipulate your sympathies right now." I did not let Captain Donovan answer. I stepped forward, my thumb resting lightly on the active button of the remote control. I locked eyes with the veteran police officer, refusing to let my father rewrite history for a second time. "Captain Donovan," I said, cutting Richard off with a voice as sharp and uncompromising as a winter wind. "The last time my father lied to your face, I was 13 freezing and surviving on tap water and stale bread while they were vacationing in Europe with Brittany." "You bought their story back then. Are you going to buy it today?" Captain Donovan froze. The hardened command presence he had exuded since walking into my home faltered for a fraction of a second as the sheer, visceral weight of my words slammed into him. The memory hit him not just as a passing recollection, but as a vivid, horrifying sensory experience. The air in my luxurious Westport estate seemed to vanish, replaced entirely by the suffocating ghosts of the past. For Captain Donovan, the past bled violently into the present. He was no longer standing in a multi-million-dollar mansion surrounded by tech executives. He was a 24-year-old rookie cop standing in a freezing dark kitchen in a wealthy Boston suburb. He remembered the blinding rainstorm pounding against the windows. He remembered the heavy silence of a house that had been completely abandoned by the adults who owned it. And most of all, he remembered the crisp $100 bill sitting perfectly centered on the massive granite kitchen island. It was a single piece of paper meant to sustain a growing child for 60 days. I had not spent a single cent of it. I had been too terrified that if I went to the grocery store, the cashier would realize I was alone and call foster care. Instead, I had survived on the forgotten remnants buried in the back of the pantry. I drank tap water to fill the gnawing ache in my stomach, and rationed stale clearance bakery bread until it was too hard to bite through. I wore 3 layers of sweaters because the heating had been completely shut off to save money while they stayed in luxury Parisian suites. Donovan remembered finding me huddled in the corner of my dark bedroom, my lips tinted a dangerous shade of blue. He remembered wrapping his heavy wool police jacket around my violently shivering shoulders. And he remembered the exact moment my parents finally walked through the front door a week later. They were tanned, laughing, and wearing tailored European coats. Richard had looked the young rookie cop dead in the eye, handed him a perfectly forged summer camp brochure, and spun a masterful lie about a rebellious teenager sneaking back home. Donovan had been young, intimidated by their wealth, and eager to close the case. He had bought the lie and left me entirely in their custody. The horrific realization of what he had truly walked away from all those years ago washed over Captain Donovan's face. The veteran officer clenched his jaw so tightly the muscles fluttered beneath his skin. He looked at my father with a hatred so pure and concentrated it made Richard physically take a step backward. The trauma of that freezing 13-year-old girl was now inextricably woven into the current standoff. The man who had abandoned me was standing in my home, trying to execute the exact same manipulation playbook decades later. "Do not speak to me, Richard," Captain Donovan growled, his voice dropping into a lethal, terrifying register. "Do not open your mouth. Do not attempt to gaslight me." I remember the ice on the inside of those windows. I remember the starvation in her eyes. I have carried the guilt of believing your wealthy, arrogant lies for my entire career. I am not that young rookie anymore, and you are not walking away from this tonight. Patricia let out a high-pitched, terrified gasp, stepping backward until her back hit the wall. The flawless maternal mask she had worn for her entire life was completely obliterated. The wealthy investors and tech executives gathered in my living room watched in absolute stunned silence. The sheer depravity of what my parents had done to me was finally exposed to the exact social circle they so desperately wanted to impress. The whispered rumors of my difficult childhood were suddenly replaced by the cold, hard facts of criminal child abandonment. Jamal, sensing the absolute collapse of his authority, tried to aggressively insert himself back into the narrative. He was a corporate lawyer, and he operated on the delusion that any situation could be controlled if he simply spoke loudly enough and cited enough legal jargon. "Captain, this is entirely irrelevant to the current legal proceedings," Jamal demanded, stepping forward and waving the useless conservatorship papers in the air. "You are letting personal emotional bias cloud a civil mandate. Whatever happened 20 years ago has absolutely no bearing on her current psychological competency. We are here to secure her assets and execute a court order. If you refuse to enforce this document, I will personally ensure your badge is stripped for dereliction of duty." Captain Donovan slowly turned his head to look at my brother-in-law. The veteran officer did not raise his voice. He did not yell. He simply unclipped the radio from his shoulder and held it in his hand. Counselor Donovan said, his tone devoid of any patience, "I already told you that your paperwork is geographically invalid and targets assets that do not exist under her name. You are currently trespassing. And if you threaten my badge one more time, I will have you face down on this marble floor in handcuffs for interfering with an ongoing police investigation. Because right now I am looking at a suspect who just committed assault, and I am looking at a group of conspirators who tried to use my officers to execute a fraudulent financial takeover. Now step back and keep your mouth shut before I make you my primary target." Jamal's mouth opened and closed silently. The threat of actual physical arrest finally pierced through his impenetrable arrogance. He took a slow, humiliating step backward, lowering the court documents to his side. Brittany grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit fabric. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that the helpless sister she loved to torment was completely gone. I was in absolute control of the room, and I held the weapon that was about to destroy her entire life. I looked at the four of them, trapped in the center of my home, cornered by the police they had foolishly brought to intimidate me. The prelude was officially over. It was time for the main event. I aimed the small remote control directly at the custom wood paneling on the far wall. As the chief technology officer of a cybersecurity firm, I did not just lock doors. I gathered intelligence. I pressed the center button, and the heavy wooden panels silently slid apart, revealing a massive ultra-high-definition presentation screen. The brilliant blue light illuminated the dark corners of the room, casting long, dramatic shadows across Jamal's sweating face. "You want to talk about competency, Jamal?" I asked, my voice echoing loudly through the silent estate. "You want to talk about who is stealing money from this family? Let us take a very close look at your offshore portfolio. Let us show Connecticut high society exactly how the golden child and her brilliant husband fund their extravagant lifestyle." The glowing blue light of the presentation screen bathed the room, casting long, stark shadows across the imported marble floor. Jamal stared at the blank, illuminated screen as if he were looking directly into the barrel of a loaded weapon. He knew exactly what was hiding inside those offshore accounts, because he was the one who had illegally set them up. The momentary silence in the room was shattered by his sudden frantic movement. He turned his back on the screen and marched directly toward Captain Donovan, completely abandoning whatever shred of self-preservation he had left. Desperation makes arrogant men incredibly stupid, and Jamal was the most arrogant man I had ever met. He completely ignored the captain's previous warning about threatening his badge. Instead, Jamal tried to aggressively weaponize his smooth-talking corporate lawyer persona, desperately hoping to intimidate the veteran officer into submission before the first slide could load. "Captain Donovan, you need to shut this down immediately," Jamal ordered, his voice vibrating with a frantic edge that he tried to mask behind a wall of legal authority. "What she is about to do constitutes criminal defamation, corporate espionage, and a massive violation of our civil rights. She is accessing private financial records without a subpoena. This is cyber terrorism. As an officer of the law, you are legally obligated to prevent a crime from occurring in your presence." Captain Donovan simply stared at him, his face completely impassive. Jamal took that silence as hesitation and pushed even harder, leaning forward and pointing a manicured finger directly at the captain's chest. "I am not asking you any more, Captain. I am telling you," Jamal hissed, his voice echoing through the silent living room. "You will place her in handcuffs right now. You will confiscate that remote control, and you will execute the medical hold as dictated by the court. If you refuse, I will not just take your badge. I will take your pension. I will drag your name through internal affairs, and I will personally sue this precinct for millions of dollars. I play golf with the police commissioner Donovan. Do you really want to lose your entire career over a psychotic woman's delusions? The wealthy investors and tech executives watching the scene unfold exchanged shocked glances. Threatening a precinct captain in a room full of witnesses was professional suicide, but Jamal was backed into a corner and fighting for his life. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and stood tall, fully expecting the police officer to fold under the weight of his corporate influence. Captain Donovan did not flinch. He did not reach for his handcuffs. He simply looked at Jamal with the absolute exhaustion of a man who had dealt with $1,000 suits and 10-cent morals his entire life. Donovan slowly reached out and pulled the thick manila folder from the younger rookie officer's hands. "You talk a lot for a man who does not know how to file basic legal paperwork," Donovan said, his voice low and rumbling with absolute authority. He opened the folder and flipped directly to the third page, holding it up so the crystal chandeliers illuminated the dense black text. "You keep waving this document around, claiming it gives you absolute authority over her life," Donovan continued, his eyes locked onto Jamal. "But since you want to threaten my pension and call the commissioner, let us take a very close look at what you actually brought into this house." Donovan tapped the top of the page with his thick index finger. "First of all, this is a petition for an emergency conservatorship. It is a request for a future hearing. It is not a finalized court order. There is no magistrate's seal on the bottom of page 4. The judge's signature you keep pointing to is simply an acknowledgement of receipt by the clerk of courts." Jamal's jaw dropped slightly. He had banked entirely on the police being too intimidated by his aggressive attitude and the thick stack of legal jargon to actually read the fine print. He had assumed he could bluff his way through the evening. Donovan was not finished. He turned to the next page, mercilessly tearing apart Jamal's entire master plan in front of Connecticut's most powerful elite. The notary signature on the witness affidavit expired 3 months ago. Donovan stated, his voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. "And as we already established, the residential jurisdiction is completely invalid. You do not have a warrant, counselor. You have a preliminary filing that has not even been assigned a court date. You brought a glorified permission slip to a home invasion," Donovan stated, dropping the manila folder onto the floor right at Jamal's expensive leather shoes. "You deliberately misrepresented a preliminary document as an executable warrant to intimidate my patrol officers into helping you commit financial fraud. That is a felony. So if you want to call the police commissioner, I suggest you do it right now, because you are going to need a very good defense attorney to explain why you are attempting to extort a civilian in front of the police." Jamal's face completely crumbled. The smooth-talking corporate powerhouse vanished, leaving behind a terrified, exposed fraud. He stared at the legal documents scattered across the broken glass on the floor, unable to comprehend how rapidly his meticulously planned ambush had fallen apart. He had walked into my home expecting to conquer an empire, and instead, he had just been legally dismantled by a precinct captain who saw right through his expensive facade. Before Jamal could even attempt to stammer out a defense, Brittany completely lost her mind. The absolute destruction of their plan, combined with the looming threat of the presentation screen, finally broke her carefully crafted golden child facade. She shoved past her mother and marched toward the police officers, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated greed. The sweet, caring sister act she had put on for the guests completely evaporated. "Arrest her!" Brittany screeched, her voice hitting a shrill, piercing note that made several of my guests physically wince. "You are useless. All of you are completely useless. Arrest her right now and turn off that screen." Brittany pointed a shaking, furious finger at me, her bright blue eyes wide with panic. "She is crazy. She has always been crazy. She is ruining our lives. We need that money. We are entitled to that money. She owes us for everything we had to put up with when we were kids." The room recoiled in disgust. Brittany had just screamed the quiet part out loud. She had just publicly admitted that this entire orchestrated nightmare was never about my mental health or my well-being. It was entirely about their greed. She felt entitled to the millions of dollars I had bled to build simply because we shared the same DNA. Patricia grabbed Brittany's arm, desperately trying to pull her golden child back and silence her before she did any more damage. "Shut up, Brittany," Patricia hissed through clenched teeth, her eyes darting nervously toward the wealthy investors who were now looking at my family with open contempt. "Stop talking. You are ruining everything." "I am not shutting up," Brittany yelled, ripping her arm away from her mother's grasp. She turned her furious gaze toward Jamal, who was still paralyzed by the captain's verbal beatdown. "Do something, Jamal. You promised me this would work. You said we would have our accounts drained by midnight. You said we could pay off the loans before the audit. Fix this right now." Jamal squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he could sink into the floor. His own wife had just publicly confessed to their financial desperation and heavily implied their underlying criminal activity. The absolute incompetence of their alliance was staggering. They were so used to manipulating a helpless teenager that they had completely failed to prepare for a fully grown woman who fought back. Captain Donovan looked at Brittany, his expression hardening into stone. "Ma'am, if you do not lower your voice and step back, I will have you placed in the back of a squad car for disturbing the peace and interfering with an investigation." Brittany gasped, acting as if she had just been physically struck. She looked at the police officer, then looked around the grand living room, suddenly realizing that no one was on her side. The sympathy she usually commanded with her pretty face and fake tears was entirely gone. My guests were looking at her as if she were a wild, dangerous animal that had broken into a museum. I watched my sister's spectacular public meltdown with a deep, profound sense of peace. For decades, I had been the one crying, the one begging to be heard, the one called crazy and unstable when I tried to point out their toxic behavior. Now the roles were permanently reversed. I was the calm, collected executive standing in my own multi-million-dollar home while the golden child threw a desperate, unhinged temper tantrum on my floor. I turned my attention away from my screaming sister and looked directly at Jamal. The panic in his eyes was glorious. "You should have read the fine print, Jamal," I said softly, breaking the tense silence that followed Brittany's outburst. "But since you are so eager to talk about audits and loans, let us not keep our guests waiting any longer." I pressed the button on my remote control again. The presentation screen behind me flashed, and the first slide loaded in brilliant, high-definition color. The financial guillotine was primed and ready to drop. The first image that materialized on the massive high-definition screen was not a photograph or a simple bank statement. It was a complex, meticulously detailed flowchart that I had personally designed. The lines and arrows glowed against the dark background, connecting dozens of seemingly unrelated corporate entities spanning across 3 different continents. At the very top of the chart, in bold white letters, was the name of Jamal's prestigious corporate law firm. At the bottom, terminating in a series of offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands and the Seychelles, were the names of 3 obscure shell companies. I turned to face my audience of tech executives and investors, allowing them a few seconds to absorb the massive web of financial data displayed before them. As the founder of an elite cybersecurity firm, I do not just build firewalls to keep hackers out of government databases, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. I specialize in tracking digital footprints. I specialize in finding the invisible threads people leave behind when they think they are operating entirely in the dark. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Jamal, who was currently staring at the screen with his mouth slightly open. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost trapped inside his expensive tailored suit. For the past 3 years, I completely cut this family out of my life. I continued keeping my cold gaze locked onto my brother-in-law. I changed my phone number, I moved my assets into blind trusts, and I built my empire in absolute peace. I never checked their social media, and I never asked mutual acquaintances how they were doing. But 3 months ago, my network security team flagged a series of highly sophisticated intrusion attempts targeting my personal public records and my secondary corporate accounts. Someone was actively trying to map my financial portfolio from the outside. Jamal swallowed hard, taking a tiny involuntary step backward, as if the giant screen behind me was radiating physical heat. His eyes darted rapidly between the flowchart and my face, his arrogant legal mind desperately trying to calculate exactly how much I knew. Most people would have just blocked the IP addresses and moved on, I said, offering him a cold, humorless smile. But I am not most people, Jamal. I did not just block the intrusion. I traced it. I followed the digital breadcrumbs right back to a private encrypted server registered to your home office. You were not just looking for my money out of idle curiosity. You were running a targeted reconnaissance mission because you were looking for a lifeline. Jamal clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. This is completely fabricated. Jamal stammered, his voice weak and trembling, a stark contrast to the booming courtroom tone he had used earlier. You hacked my personal computer. This is illegal. You cannot use this. Captain Donovan, she is confessing to cyber terrorism right in front of you. I am not confessing to anything, Jamal, I reminded him smoothly. I did not hack your computer. You were so sloppy and so incredibly arrogant that you left your secondary server completely unpatched. You practically left the front door wide open for anyone with a basic understanding of network architecture. You used the same administrative password for your home network that you used for your country club membership. It was insulting how easy it was to walk right into your digital life. Several of the tech executives in the room let out quiet scoffs of amusement. For a man who claimed to be a corporate powerhouse, Jamal had made the most amateur mistake possible in the modern digital age. He had tried to hunt a cybersecurity expert using a network with zero operational security. You thought I was just sitting in this house waiting to be attacked? I asked, taking another step closer to him. You thought because I was quiet, I was weak. But the moment you pinged my servers, Jamal, you became a verified threat to my enterprise. And I do not ignore threats. I dismantle them. I spent the last 3 months legally acquiring public transaction records, matching them against your sloppy digital footprints, and building a complete forensic map of your entire life. I pressed the button on my remote control again. The presentation screen zoomed in on the 3 shell companies located at the bottom of the flowchart. The names of the entities filled the screen, accompanied by their official registration documents from the Cayman Islands. These 3 corporations were registered exactly 18 months ago. I announced, the sheer clarity of the evidence echoing off the marble floors. They have no physical offices, they have no employees, and they produce absolutely no goods or services. They exist for one single purpose: to act as a digital vault for massive untraceable cash deposits. Brittany stared at the screen, her chest heaving as she struggled to process the information. She had always known her husband was ambitious and ruthless, but she had clearly believed his wealth was legitimate. She believed she was married to a brilliant legal mastermind who outsmarted everyone else in the boardroom. Seeing his hidden offshore accounts plastered on a screen in front of Connecticut high society was severely damaging her pristine reality. "Those are perfectly legal tax shelters," Jamal yelled, desperately trying to regain control of the narrative. He looked at the wealthy investors in the crowd, hoping to find sympathy among fellow millionaires. Every major corporation uses offshore accounts to minimize tax liabilities. You are trying to criminalize standard financial practices to make me look like a villain. This proves absolutely nothing, Abigail. You are blowing smoke to distract from your own mental instability. Captain Donovan crossed his arms over his broad chest, watching Jamal squirm with absolute disgust. The veteran police officer did not say a word, allowing me to completely dismantle the arrogant lawyer piece by piece. "You are absolutely right, Jamal," I agreed, my voice dropping into a lethal calm register. Simply owning an offshore account is not inherently illegal. It is what you put inside those accounts, and exactly where that money came from, that constitutes a massive federal crime. I aimed the remote at the screen again, my thumb resting lightly on the button. The trap was fully primed. I had shown them the vault, and now it was time to show everyone exactly what was hiding inside of it. You came into my home tonight waving a flawed court document claiming you needed to freeze my assets to protect my wealth, I said, my eyes boring into Jamal's terrified face. You stood in front of my guests and called me a thief. So let us look at the actual banking ledgers, Jamal. Let us show my investors and the police exactly how the golden child and her brilliant husband fund their extravagant luxury lifestyle. Let us talk about the escrow accounts. The presentation screen flashed a brilliant white before settling into a stark, high-contrast display of raw banking ledgers. The rows and columns were dense with complex financial data, but I had thoughtfully highlighted the most critical transactions in a glowing crimson red. I stepped aside, allowing the sheer volume of the stolen money to speak for itself. These are the master escrow accounts managed by Jamal's prestigious law firm, I explained, my voice steady and echoing with undeniable authority across the silent room. When massive corporate mergers take place, or when multi-million-dollar civil settlements are finalized, the funds are temporarily held in these highly secure accounts. Jamal, as a senior partner, had direct administrative access to route these funds. Jamal stood completely frozen. The color had not just drained from his face, it looked as though his entire soul had suddenly violently left his body. His eyes were wide and unblinking as he stared at the exact routing numbers he had desperately tried to bury under layers of digital encryption and offshore corporate legal shields. For the first 2 years, Jamal was careful. I continued pacing slowly across the broken glass on my floor, making sure my voice reached every corner of the grand estate. He skimmed the interest. He took fractional percentages that were easily written off as administrative fees or standard accounting errors. But greed is a bottomless pit. Eventually, the fractional percentages were not enough to sustain the massive inflated image he wanted to project to the world. He started moving raw principal funds. I pointed to a specific highlighted row on the massive screen. On October 12th of last year, exactly $450,000 was quietly transferred from a corporate client settlement fund into one of the Cayman Island shell companies we just looked at. 3 days later, that exact same amount was bounced through a secondary trust in the Bahamas and deposited directly into Jamal and Brittany's joint personal checking account. The heavy silver tablet Jamal had been clutching slipped from his suddenly lifeless fingers. It hit the imported marble floor with a sharp, violent crack. The high-definition screen of his device spiderwebbed into 100 jagged pieces, perfectly mirroring the absolute destruction of his entire professional and personal life. He did not even look down at it. He simply stared at the projected ledgers, taking short, shallow breaths. But moving massive amounts of stolen corporate funds comes with a very specific problem, I said, looking directly at my sister, who was now shaking uncontrollably. You have to clean it. You have to make it look legitimate to the federal tax agencies, or at the very least, you have to be quiet about spending it. But my sister has never been quiet a single day in her life. I pressed the button on my sleek remote control again. The massive screen behind me split perfectly in half. On the left side, the banking ledger displayed a wire transfer for $82,000 stolen from a client's corporate pension fund. On the right side of the screen, a massive high-definition screenshot of Brittany's social media page appeared. It was a photo of Brittany wearing oversized designer sunglasses, posing triumphantly in front of a brand-new, fully loaded Porsche SUV parked in their manicured driveway. The caption beneath the photo read, "Hubby spoils me because I deserve the absolute best." The date of the wire transfer was May 14th, I announced, pointing at the screen. The date my sister purchased a luxury vehicle in pure cash and bragged about it to her 5,000 followers was May 16th. I clicked the remote again. A new ledger appeared alongside a new photo, a transfer for $45,000. A photo of Brittany clinking crystal champagne flutes in a first-class cabin on her way to a luxury ski resort in Aspen. I clicked it again. A transfer for $27,000. A video of Brittany unboxing a rare limited edition designer handbag, complaining to the camera about how exhausting it was to be a highly demanded VIP client at the boutique. A collective gasp rippled through my guests. The wealthy tech executives and investors in the room were not just shocked by the dramatic family confrontation, they were fundamentally horrified by the sheer audacity of the financial crime. Several of them recognized Jamal's law firm. The realization that he was an active corporate embezzler sent a shockwave of profound disgust through the crowd. "You did not just steal from faceless megacorporations, Jamal," I said, my voice dropping into a tone of absolute unfiltered contempt. "You stole from employee pension funds. You stole from medical settlement escrows. And you handed it all over to a woman who used it to buy designer purses and luxury vacations just so she could pretend she was better than everyone else." The illusion of the perfect golden child marriage completely and violently imploded right in front of us. Jamal suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed state. The crushing weight of inevitable federal prison sentences and a permanently destroyed legal career crashed down on him all at once. The suave protective husband routine vanished instantly, replaced by the vicious, unhinged instinct of a cornered animal desperate to survive. He spun around and grabbed Brittany by the shoulders, his fingers digging brutally into her arms. "I told you to stop posting," he screamed at her, a spray of saliva hitting her face. His voice was ragged and hysterical, completely unrecognizable from the smooth, confident tone he had used to threaten the police earlier. "I told you to keep a low profile. I told you to stop using the primary routing accounts for your idiotic shopping sprees. You left a digital paper trail a mile wide, you stupid, careless woman." Brittany shrieked, trying desperately to pull away from his crushing grip. The golden child who had spent her entire 31 years of life being shielded from every single consequence was suddenly taking the full, brutal brunt of a massive criminal conspiracy. "Get your hands off me!" Brittany screamed back, slapping violently at his chest. "You told me the money was ours. You told me you earned those massive corporate bonuses. You told me I deserved to live like this because I am your wife. You are the brilliant lawyer. You were supposed to hide it." "Hide it!" Jamal roared, shaking her so hard her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and crashed to the floor, spilling expensive makeup across the marble. "How am I supposed to hide it when you are broadcasting every single dollar we spend to the entire world? You ruined me. You completely destroyed my entire life. I am going to federal prison because you could not stop bragging about a stupid handbag." He shoved her away with such terrifying force that Brittany stumbled backward, her high heels slipping on the polished floor. She collided heavily with Richard. My father, who was still recovering from being thrown across the room by my security guard, barely caught her before they both tumbled. "You lied to me," Brittany sobbed, her perfectly styled blonde hair falling wildly around her tear-streaked face. She pointed an accusing, trembling finger at her husband. "You dragged me into this. You said Abigail was an easy target. You said if we got the conservatorship, we could use her massive company accounts to replace the stolen money before the quarterly federal audits caught you. This is all your fault." Captain Donovan stood perfectly still, his hands resting comfortably on his heavy duty belt, watching the two arrogant criminals completely unravel. They were voluntarily confessing to massive federal crimes, including wire fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy, in a room full of high-profile witnesses, with a senior police captain standing less than 10 feet away. It was the most spectacular self-destruction I had ever witnessed in my entire life. Patricia clamped her hands tightly over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut as if she could simply block out the nightmare unfolding around her. Her perfect family, her wealthy, successful son-in-law, her beautiful golden daughter, they were all tearing each other apart like rabid dogs in the center of my living room, and I was the one holding the remote control. I watched them scream and cry and blame each other, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure washing over my soul. They had spent my entire childhood making me feel small, worthless, and disposable. They had tried to break into my sanctuary tonight and steal the life I built from the ground up. But standing there bathed in the glow of the presentation screen, projecting their crimes to the world, I realized they had never actually been powerful. They were just greedy, careless parasites living in a house of cards. And I had just set the entire thing on fire. I let them scream at each other for a few more seconds, It was a fascinating display of parasitic survival, but the golden child and her husband were only half of the equation. I turned my attention to the two people who had enabled this entire nightmare. Patricia was still pressing her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut. Richard was staring at the floor, looking like a man who had just been sentenced to the gallows. I raised the remote control and pressed the button one final time. The split screen vanished. The social media photos and the escrow ledgers were replaced by a single massive scanned document. It was not a bank statement. It was a commercial loan application from one of the largest private wealth banks in the country. The requested amount was staggering: $4.5 million. Jamal stopped yelling at Brittany. He slowly turned his head to look at the screen, and whatever fight was left in his body instantly evaporated. His knees actually buckled, and he had to grab the back of a nearby leather chair to keep from collapsing onto the broken glass. You see, Jamal was incredibly arrogant. But he was not completely stupid, I announced, making sure my voice carried over the lingering murmurs of my guests. He knew the quarterly federal audits were approaching. He knew that the moment the auditors looked at those escrow accounts, the missing millions would trigger an immediate federal investigation. He needed a massive injection of cash to quietly replace the stolen funds before anyone noticed they were gone. I walked closer to the presentation screen, pointing at the glowing text. So Jamal went to a private bank and applied for a massive commercial bridge loan. He planned to use the loan to replace the stolen escrow money past the federal audit and then figure out how to pay back the bank later. It was a classic Ponzi scheme maneuver. But there was a massive problem. Jamal and Brittany had leveraged themselves to the absolute limit, buying luxury cars and Aspen ski trips. The bank looked at their debt-to-income ratio and immediately denied the application. I turned my gaze to my parents. They needed guarantors. I said, my voice dropping into a cold, deadly register. They needed people with pristine credit and substantial assets to co-sign the loan and assume the massive financial risk. I tapped the remote and the screen zoomed in on the bottom of the final page of the loan document. 3 signatures rested on the dotted lines. Richard and Patricia stepped up to the plate. I continued, looking directly at my father. You co-signed a fraudulent commercial loan to help your son-in-law cover up his massive corporate embezzlement. You tied your retirement, your home, and your entire financial future to a sinking ship because you could not bear the thought of your precious golden child losing her luxury lifestyle and facing a federal judge. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Captain Donovan, who was currently inspecting the projected document with the focused intensity of a predator. But even your combined assets were not enough to secure a $4.5 million loan, I said, bringing the final hammer down. The bank demanded a third guarantor. They needed someone with massive liquid capital and an impeccable financial history. I pointed to the third signature on the screen. It was my name, Abigail, written in cursive ink right beneath the signatures of the people who had abandoned me. The silence in the living room was so profound I could hear the distant sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shoreline outside. I have not spoken to any of you in 3 years, I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. I did not sign that document. I was never in the room when that document was drafted. Someone in this room printed my name and forged my signature on a multi-million-dollar commercial bank loan. Patricia let out a guttural, devastating wail. She dropped to her knees right there on the polished marble floor, completely ignoring the sharp fragments of broken glass. She covered her face with her hands, rocking back and forth. It was not me, Patricia sobbed, her voice muffled and frantic. Jamal told us to do it. Jamal said it was the only way to save the family. He said you had plenty of money and you would never even know about the loan. He promised he would pay it back. She had just confessed to felony forgery in front of a police captain. Richard fell to his knees next to her, completely broken. He tried to put his arm around his wife, but she weakly pushed him away. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had tried to physically assault me just 20 minutes ago was now a weeping, pathetic mess on my floor. I looked at Captain Donovan. The pieces of the puzzle were finally fully assembled. This was never about my mental health, I stated, looking at the veteran police officer. The conservatorship was a panicked last-ditch effort. The bank flagged the forged signature during their final underwriting process and denied the loan entirely. The audit is scheduled for Monday morning. Jamal and my parents realized they were completely out of time and out of options. They needed raw liquid cash tonight. I swept my hand toward Jamal and my parents. They fabricated a medical emergency, bribed or manipulated a judge into signing a preliminary hearing notice, and brought your patrol officers here to intimidate me into handing over the keys to my empire. They planned to drain my corporate accounts the second I was locked inside a psychiatric ward. They were going to use my money to pay back the money they stole so they could stay out of federal prison. The sheer depravity of the plot was finally laid bare. It was an orchestrated financial assault born of absolute desperation. They had been willing to completely destroy my life, lock me inside a medical facility against my will, and steal my entire life's work, simply to save themselves from the consequences of their own boundless greed. Captain Donovan stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching on the glass. The look on his face was one of absolute cold professional fury. He looked at Jamal, who was still clinging to the chair, staring blankly at the floor. He looked at Brittany, who was sobbing uncontrollably against the wall, and he looked at my parents kneeling in the ruins of their shattered illusions. "You forged a signature on a commercial bank document," Donovan stated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You conspired to commit fraud, you embezzled corporate funds, and you filed a false police report to execute an illegal eviction." Jamal slowly lifted his head. He looked at me with eyes completely devoid of the arrogant spark that had defined his entire existence. "You set us up," Jamal whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "You knew about the loan. You knew the audit was coming. You waited for us to walk into this house." "I did not set you up, Jamal," I replied calmly. "I just built a fortress and you were stupid enough to try and break down the front door. You dug your own grave. I just provided the shovel and invited an audience to watch you fall in." The tech executives and wealthy investors in the room slowly began to murmur amongst themselves. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a deep, profound respect for how systematically I had dismantled the threat. I had not just defended my company and my home. I had completely annihilated the people who tried to take it from me. David, my chief technology officer, stepped out from the crowd and walked over to stand beside me. He looked down at my parents with absolute disgust. He pulled his phone from his pocket and looked at Captain Donovan. Captain David said, his voice steady and professional. "I have the entire digital dossier containing the escrow ledgers, the shell company registrations, and the forged loan documents. I compiled it on a secure encrypted drive. Where would you like me to send it?" Captain Donovan reached to his shoulder and unclipped his police radio. He did not take his eyes off my family as he pressed the transmission button. "Dispatch, this is Captain Donovan," he commanded, his voice echoing through the massive estate. "I need 4 additional units and a transport van at my location immediately. We have multiple suspects in custody for felony fraud, forgery, and conspiracy." The crackle of the police radio confirming the request sounded like the most beautiful music I had ever heard. The nightmare was finally over. The financial guillotine had dropped, and it had severed every single tie connecting me to the people who had tried to destroy me. I stood there watching the absolute ruin of the people who had abandoned me. When I was 13 years old, I used to cry myself to sleep, wondering what was wrong with me. I used to wonder why I was not enough for them, why they loved Brittany so effortlessly, while treating my existence as a heavy burden. I spent years trying to earn their respect, trying to prove that I was worthy of a seat at their table. But looking at them now, stripped of their arrogant masks and their stolen wealth, I realized the most liberating truth of my entire life. They did not abandon me because I was broken. They abandoned me because they were empty. They were hollow, greedy people who only valued what they could extract from others. I was never the problem. I was simply the only person in the family who refused to play their toxic games. The sound of distant police sirens began to wail through the crisp autumn night air, growing louder and more persistent with every passing second. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect against the massive glass windows of my estate, washing over the imported marble floors and the broken crystal. My guests stepped back, clearing a wide path toward the heavy custom front doors. No one spoke. No one offered a word of comfort to the sobbing woman on the floor, or the defeated men standing beside her. They were entirely isolated, trapped in a prison of their own design, waiting for the authorities to arrive and collect them. I slowly lowered the remote control and placed it onto the silver tray next to my untouched glass of sparkling water. I smoothed the lapels of my emerald green suit, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of my success grounding me. I had survived the freezing dark house, and I had survived their final desperate attack. I had won. The wail of the approaching sirens acted as a massive, unavoidable catalyst in the room. The moment Captain Donovan confirmed the transport vans were en route, the fragile alliance holding my toxic family together completely dissolved. There was no loyalty among thieves, and there was certainly no love left in a family built entirely on lies and financial greed. I watched in absolute fascination as the united front of the perfect family shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. Richard scrambled to his feet, his expensive suit ruined, and his dignity completely non-existent. He practically shoved Patricia aside to get closer to Captain Donovan. "Officer, you have to listen to me," Richard pleaded, his voice entirely stripped of its former arrogant boom. "We are victims here. We are elderly people who were completely manipulated by a predatory corporate attorney." Patricia instantly caught on to Richard's desperate pivot. She possessed a terrifying ability to instantly adapt her victim narrative to fit any situation. She nodded vigorously, wiping her mascara-stained face and pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at Jamal. "Yes," Patricia cried out, her voice taking on a desperate, hysterical pitch. "He is a monster. He came to us crying last month, saying his law firm was in terrible financial trouble. He told us that if we did not help him secure that commercial loan, the dangerous people he owed money to would physically hurt our daughter. We did not know he was actively stealing from corporate pensions. We just wanted to protect Brittany. He forced us to sign that paperwork under extreme duress." Jamal looked at his parents-in-law with an expression of pure, unadulterated venom. The sheer audacity of their lie temporarily snapped him out of his paralyzed shock. He stood up straight, his vicious survival instincts completely overriding his panic. The smooth-talking lawyer was dead, replaced by a cornered criminal who was perfectly willing to drag everyone down into the abyss with him. "You lying, parasitic cowards!" Jamal spat, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "Do not you dare try to pin your felony forgery on me. You knew exactly what you were doing. You signed her name because you are drowning in your own second mortgages and secret credit card debt, just trying to keep up the illusion that you are wealthy. You needed the kickback money from that loan just as much as I needed to cover the audit." Jamal turned his back on them and looked directly at Captain Donovan, his legal mind rapidly calculating his only remaining way out of a decade in federal lockup. Captain Jamal said, his tone suddenly adopting a sickeningly cooperative and desperate cadence. "I am a licensed attorney, and I know exactly how federal investigations operate. I know I am facing severe charges tonight, but I also possess the master decryption keys for every single offshore account shown on that screen. I have the physical paper trail proving Richard and Patricia actively participated in the wire fraud to pay off their own personal debts." Brittany gasped, staring at her husband in absolute horror. Jamal did not even look at her. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the police captain, bartering his family for a lighter sentence. "I will gladly hand over every single piece of encrypted evidence to the district attorney," Jamal offered, throwing his entire family under the bus without a second of hesitation. "I will testify against all three of them in open federal court in exchange for a plea deal and full immunity from the forgery charges." They forged Abigail's signature. "I just provided the blank paperwork. I can give you the entire conspiracy on a silver platter." Richard lunged forward, his hands outstretched like claws, trying to physically attack Jamal for a second time. "You son of a bitch!" Richard roared, spittle flying from his lips as he desperately tried to close the distance. "I will kill you before I let you put me in a federal prison." Captain Donovan simply stepped into Richard's path, planting a heavy, immovable hand firmly against my father's chest and shoving him violently backward. "Do not move," Donovan commanded, his voice echoing like a thunderclap and completely halting Richard in his tracks. The scene in my beautiful living room devolved into a pathetic, vicious feeding frenzy. They were exactly like rabid dogs trapped in a cage, tearing chunks out of each other to see who could survive the longest. Patricia was screaming at Jamal, calling him a complete failure as a man and a thief. Jamal was screaming back, listing every single luxury item Patricia had demanded he buy for her to keep her quiet about the embezzled funds. They were voluntarily screaming out their confessions, airing decades of dirty secrets and financial crimes, while my high society guests watched in stunned silence. And then there was Brittany, my beautiful, perfect sister, the golden child who had spent her entire life floating on a cloud of absolute privilege and protection. She stood completely frozen, looking back and forth between the people who were supposed to love her the most. She looked at her parents, who were actively trying to send her husband to prison. She looked at her husband, who was actively offering to send her parents and potentially her to prison just to save his own skin. "Nobody is protecting me," Brittany whimpered, her voice incredibly small and broken. "Mom, Dad, you are supposed to protect me. Jamal, you promised you would take care of me." Jamal finally turned to look at his wife, and the absolute contempt in his eyes was staggering. "Grow up, Brittany." Jamal sneered, his voice completely devoid of any affection or warmth. "You spent $3 million of stolen money on designer clothes and luxury vacations, while I lived in a constant state of panic trying to hide it from the government. You are an active accessory to federal wire fraud. Nobody can protect you now. You are entirely on your own." Brittany let out a hollow, devastated sob and slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, clutching her knees to her chest. The golden child had finally fallen from her pedestal, and the landing was absolutely brutal. I stood silently near the glowing presentation screen, watching the spectacular, chaotic collapse of their twisted dynamic. The wealthy investors, tech executives, and state politicians who had come to celebrate my company's success were watching the exact same thing. They were witnessing the absolute moral bankruptcy of a family that had spent decades pretending to be elite. My family had walked into this house hoping to publicly humiliate me and destroy my reputation. Instead, they had completely annihilated their own. A younger version of me, the terrified 13-year-old girl who used to cry in the dark, freezing house, might have felt a sudden twinge of pity. She might have wanted to step forward to mediate the argument, or somehow try to fix the broken pieces of her family. She might have felt guilty for causing them so much pain. But that girl died a very long time ago. She was starved out of existence by the very people currently screaming and crying on my floor. I felt absolutely nothing for them. There were no tears prickling the corners of my eyes. There was no heavy, aching sadness in my chest. There was no lingering sympathy for the mother who had given birth to me, or the father who had raised me. I looked at the four of them, and I saw nothing but strangers. They were dangerous, greedy strangers who had made a highly calculated gamble to destroy my life and were now suffering the catastrophic consequences of their own actions. My chief technology officer, David, stepped closer to me, keeping his voice low so only I could hear him over the shouting. "Are you okay, Abigail?" David asked. His eyes filled with genuine concern as he watched my father practically foaming at the mouth. I turned to David and offered a small, genuine smile. "I am perfectly fine, David," I replied, my voice completely steady and entirely at peace. "In fact, I think this is the most successful launch party we have ever hosted." David let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head in sheer amazement. "You are terrifyingly brilliant. You know that," he murmured, looking from the projected bank ledgers to my completely calm face. Just calculated, I corrected him, turning my cold stare back to my screaming family. When you spend your entire life being treated like prey, you eventually learn how to build a much better trap. It is not revenge, David. It is just cold, calculated justice. The flashing red and blue lights of the arriving police cruisers suddenly illuminated the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my estate. The lights swept across the manicured lawns and cast erratic glowing shadows into the grand foyer. The wailing sirens abruptly cut off, replaced by the harsh, aggressive sound of heavy tires crunching to a rapid halt on my gravel driveway. The cavalry had officially arrived. The final curtain was about to drop on their pathetic performance, and I was ready to watch them take their final bow. The heavy custom front doors of my estate swung fully open, pushed wide by the sudden influx of half a dozen uniformed police officers. Their heavy-duty boots thudded against the imported marble floors, a stark and jarring contrast to the soft jazz and sophisticated murmurs that had filled the room just an hour earlier. The officers moved with coordinated tactical precision, their eyes quickly scanning the shattered glass and the chaotic scene before looking to Captain Donovan for their direct orders. The wealthy investors, tech executives, and state politicians who comprised my guest list pressed themselves further back against the walls. They formed a wide, silent corridor, offering the police an unobstructed path directly to the center of the living room where my completely ruined family remained huddled. Captain Donovan did not immediately issue the order to arrest them. He took a slow, deliberate breath, squaring his broad shoulders as he looked down at the people who had orchestrated this massive, fraudulent ambush. He walked past Jamal, who was still gripping the back of the leather chair, and bypassed Brittany, who was weeping uncontrollably against the wall. He stopped directly in front of Richard and Patricia. My father was still kneeling on the floor, his ruined suit covered in fine crystal dust. Patricia was rocking back and forth, her hands still covering her face, as if she could somehow hide from the catastrophic reality crashing down upon her. "Stand up!" Captain Donovan commanded, his voice echoing with absolute uncompromising authority. Richard trembled, his arrogant, domineering patriarch persona completely annihilated. He grabbed the edge of the shattered coffee table and awkwardly hauled himself to his feet. He reached down to help Patricia, but she batted his hand away, stumbling upward on her own. They stood before the veteran police officer looking like hollow, terrified shells of the wealthy socialites they so desperately pretended to be. 21 years ago, I walked out of a freezing, dark house and left a starving 13-year-old girl in your care, Captain Donovan said, his voice dropping into a register of cold, absolute disgust. I was young, I was inexperienced, and I let your expensive clothes and your arrogant lies convince me that I was making a mistake. I handed a vulnerable child back to her abusers because you forged a summer camp brochure and threatened my department with a lawsuit. Patricia let out a high, strained whimper, unable to meet his furious gaze. Richard stared at the floor, his jaw clenching, but he remained completely silent. I have regretted leaving that little girl in your custody for 21 years, Donovan continued, the decades of carried guilt bleeding into every single word. It is a decision that has haunted my entire career. I spent years wondering if she survived you. I wondered if she ever managed to escape the psychological prison you built for her. Captain Donovan slowly turned his head, looking past my parents to where I stood calmly beside the glowing presentation screen. A look of profound respect passed between us, a silent acknowledgement of the horrific past we shared and the incredible victory of the present moment. Tonight, I get to finally close that case, Donovan said, turning his lethal stare back to Richard and Patricia. Tonight, I get to look you in the eyes and tell you that your victim outsmarted you, outlasted you, and completely destroyed you. You are the most pathetic excuses for parents I have ever encountered in my life. The absolute finality of his verdict hung heavy in the air. He had not just condemned their current financial crimes, he had validated the decades of silent suffering I had endured under their roof. It was a vindication so deep and satisfying it felt like taking a full breath of air for the first time in my life. Jamal, however, was still operating under the delusion that his legal prowess could somehow salvage his freedom. His vicious survival instincts refused to let him accept absolute defeat. He let go of the leather chair and took a desperate step toward the captain, completely ignoring his weeping wife and devastated in-laws. "Captain, I meant what I said," Jamal interrupted, his voice frantic and pleading. He held up his hands aggressively, trying to broker a deal on the ruins of his family. "I have the master decryption keys. I can give the district attorney the entire network of offshore accounts. I can give them the names of the shell companies and the routing numbers for the stolen pension funds. I will turn state's evidence right now. You do not need to arrest me. We can call the prosecutor and arrange a plea deal tonight, before this even hits the precinct." Jamal was banking on the idea that local law enforcement would be eager to secure a massive financial conviction without a protracted legal battle. He thought his inside knowledge was his golden ticket out of handcuffs. I could not help it. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that cut through the heavy tension in the room. Jamal stared at me, his eyes wide with frantic confusion. "You still do not understand what is happening here." "Do you, Jamal?" I asked slowly, walking toward him, my emerald heels clicking against the marble. "You still think you are the smartest person in the room? You think this is a local jurisdiction issue? You think you can negotiate a plea deal with a police captain over millions of dollars in stolen corporate pension funds?" Jamal swallowed hard, a fresh bead of cold sweat rolling down his temple. "What did you do?" Jamal whispered, the terrifying realization finally dawning on him that I had been 10 steps ahead of him from the very beginning. "I did not just build a colorful presentation to humiliate you in front of my friends," I said, gesturing toward the massive screen displaying his forged commercial loan. "I am the founder of a cybersecurity firm that holds top-secret clearance and works directly with federal intelligence agencies. When I traced your sloppy digital footprints to those Cayman Island shell companies, I did not call the local police. I called my federal contacts." I stopped just a few feet away from him, watching the absolute horror completely consume his face. I handed the entire encrypted dossier, including the escrow ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and this forged commercial bank loan directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation exactly 48 hours ago. I revealed, dropping the final inescapable trap right on his chest. Brittany gasped loudly, her hands flying to her mouth. Richard and Patricia simultaneously swayed on their feet, the word federal acting like a physical blow to their knees. "They already have your master decryption keys, Jamal." I continued, my voice cold and merciless. "My team cracked your secondary server in less than an hour. The FBI Cybercrimes Division has been sitting on your offshore accounts for 2 days. They already know about the stolen medical settlements. They already know about Brittany's luxury car purchases. The federal auditors are not going to surprise you on Monday morning, Jamal. They are already at your law firm right now, executing a midnight raid and seizing every single computer in your office." Jamal staggered backward, his legs completely giving out. He hit the floor hard, staring up at me with dead, vacant eyes. The master plan he had constructed to save himself had been obsolete before he even walked through my front doors. He had absolutely nothing left to bargain with. He was a cornered rat who had just realized the cage was completely locked from the outside. "You have absolutely nothing to offer the district attorney," I told him, looking down at his pathetic, ruined form. "You have no leverage. You have no immunity. You are going to face the full weight of the federal government, and you are going to do it completely alone." Captain Donovan stepped forward, signaling the waiting patrol officers with a sharp nod of his head. The officers moved in instantly, retrieving the heavy metal handcuffs from their utility belts. "Jamal, you are being detained," Donovan announced, his voice booming with official authority, as 2 officers grabbed Jamal by his tailored sleeves and roughly hauled him to his feet. "You are under arrest for felony fraud, corporate embezzlement, forgery, and filing a false police report." Jamal did not resist. He let his arms go limp, staring blankly ahead as the cold steel cuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. The smooth-talking corporate powerhouse was entirely gone, replaced by a broken federal inmate. Brittany shrieked as an officer approached her, scrambling backward until she was pinned against the wall. "No, please, I did not do anything," Brittany sobbed, holding her hands up as if she could physically push the police away. "I just spent the money. I did not steal it. He told me it was a bonus. You cannot arrest me. I am a victim. Ma'am, put your hands behind your back," the officer commanded, completely unfazed by her hysterical golden child routine. "You are being detained for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and receiving stolen property." The officer grabbed her wrists, pulling them firmly behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the room was the exact sound of Brittany's privileged consequence, free life, coming to a permanent, devastating end. She wailed a loud, ugly sound of pure entitlement, being violently stripped away. Richard and Patricia did not fight back. They were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their destruction. When the officers approached them, Richard simply held his hands out, his head bowed in absolute shame. The man who had spent his entire life demanding respect and obedience from me was now voluntarily submitting to a pair of police handcuffs in the center of my living room. Patricia wept silently, the tears ruining her expensive makeup and dripping onto her silk blouse. She looked at me one last time, her eyes silently begging for a shred of the daughterly devotion she had spent decades actively destroying. I gave her nothing. I stood perfectly still, my posture straight and my expression completely unreadable. I watched the officer secure the cuffs around her wrists, feeling the last remaining invisible chain tying me to this toxic family completely shatter. Captain Donovan walked over to the ruined coffee table and picked up the thick manila folder Jamal had brought to seize my assets. He looked at the flawed, fraudulent conservatorship paperwork one last time before shaking his head in disgust. "Take them out of here," Donovan ordered the officers, pointing toward the heavy glass front doors. "Read them their rights when you get them to the transport vans. And make sure you keep the husband separated from the rest of them. I do not want them coordinating their lies on the way to the precinct." The officers gripped the arms of my family members and began forcefully marching them toward the exit. The crowd of wealthy investors and tech executives parted in absolute silence, offering no sympathy, no comforting words, and no averting of their eyes. They watched the elite, arrogant family being paraded through the stunning multi-million-dollar estate they had tried to steal, completely humiliated and bound in steel. The cool autumn breeze swept through the grand foyer as the heavy glass doors were pushed wide open. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers cut fiercely through the darkness of my manicured driveway, casting frantic, sweeping shadows across the imported stone. The walk of shame had officially begun. I followed them out, standing on the top step of my massive portico, to watch the absolute destruction of their fabricated elite lives. My guests spilled out onto the front terrace, standing shoulder to shoulder in the crisp night air. These were the wealthiest and most influential people in the state, and they watched the spectacle with cold, unforgiving silence. There was no shouting from the crowd. There were no phones pulled out to record the humiliation because my circle operated on a level of quiet, absolute destruction. Being paraded in handcuffs in front of this specific group of people was a social death sentence from which my family would never recover. Jamal was the first to be loaded into the transport vehicles. Captain Donovan had been explicitly clear about keeping him separated. Two officers marched the disgraced corporate attorney toward an armored police van. Jamal walked with his head hung low, his expensive designer shoes dragging against the gravel. Right before the officers pushed him into the dark back seat, he stopped and looked over his shoulder. He looked past the police cruisers, past the perfectly manicured hedges, and locked eyes with me one final time. There was no arrogance left in his expression. There was only the hollow, terrifying realization that he was a man who had flown too close to the sun, and I was the one who had burned his wings. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind him, swallowing him into the darkness. Brittany was an entirely different story. She fought the humiliation with every ounce of her remaining entitlement. She dragged her feet twisting and thrashing against the officer holding her arms. As she kicked out one of her expensive stiletto heels, caught on the edge of a stone paver and snapped completely off. She stumbled heavily, her perfectly styled blonde hair falling into a messy, tangled disaster around her tear-streaked face. "You cannot do this to me!" Brittany screamed, her voice echoing shrilly into the quiet suburban night. "I have a country club membership. I know the mayor. Call my lawyer right now." She was completely hysterical, entirely forgetting that her lawyer was currently locked inside the armored police van parked 10 feet away. The officer simply ignored her frantic demands, placing a firm hand on the top of her head and guiding her into the back of a separate squad car. She pressed her face against the reinforced glass, sobbing openly as the reality of her shattered golden life finally crushed her. Richard and Patricia were the last to be escorted down the steps. The arrogant patriarch who had tried to physically assault me in my own home now looked like a frail, broken old man. He shuffled his feet, avoiding the gaze of every single person standing on the terrace. Patricia walked beside him, her head bowed, her silk blouse wrinkled and stained with mascara. She had spent her entire life carefully curating the image of a flawless, upper-class mother. Now she was doing the perpetrator walk across a police-illuminated driveway, surrounded by the exact high society peers she had always desperately wanted to impress. The officers secured them in the back of a cruiser, and the heavy doors clicked shut, sealing their fate. Captain Donovan walked up the steps and stopped right in front of me. He touched the brim of his uniform cap in a gesture of profound respect. "The area is secure, ma'am." Donovan said, his voice steady and professional. "Detectives will be in touch with your legal team in the morning to formally process the digital evidence." "Have a good night, Abigail." "Thank you, Captain," I replied, offering him a genuine nod of gratitude. "For everything." He turned and walked back down the steps, getting into his unmarked command vehicle. One by one, the police cruisers shifted into gear. The tires crunched loudly against the gravel as the caravan of flashing lights pulled out of my estate and disappeared down the winding coastal road. The wailing sirens faded into the distance, leaving behind nothing but the quiet, soothing sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shoreline. I turned around and walked back inside my home. My security team quietly closed the massive glass doors behind me, shutting out the cold night air. The living room was a disaster zone of broken crystal and shattered illusions, but the atmosphere had entirely changed. The suffocating, toxic weight that my family had brought into the room was completely gone. David, my chief technology officer, signaled the waitstaff. The servers seamlessly moved back into the room, sweeping up the broken glass and distributing fresh trays of expensive champagne. David raised his crystal flute high in the air, looking around the room at our investors and colleagues. To the absolute strongest woman I have ever met, David announced, his voice booming with pride. And to the most successful corporate acquisition this state has ever seen. The room erupted into genuine applause. The glasses clinked, the jazz music resumed over the surround sound system, and the party continued not as a simple business celebration, but as a triumphant victory over the shadows of my past. I took a sip of my champagne, feeling a profound warmth spread through my chest. The war was officially over. The fallout from that night was swift, brutal, and entirely public. I did not have to lift another finger. I simply sat back and watched the federal justice system systematically dismantle the monsters who had raised me. Exactly as I had predicted, the federal auditors arrived at Jamal's prestigious law firm at 8 o'clock on Monday morning. They were accompanied by a team of FBI agents who immediately locked down the building and seized every single computer server and physical file in the office. Because I had already handed over the master decryption keys, the federal agents bypassed all of Jamal's security protocols in a matter of minutes. The evidence of his massive corporate embezzlement was undeniable. Jamal's law license was suspended immediately pending a formal disbarment hearing, which he lost spectacularly. The partners at his firm violently distanced themselves from him, filing their own massive civil lawsuits against him for destroying their corporate reputation. Facing decades in federal lockup, Jamal attempted to secure a plea deal, but the prosecutor laughed in his face. The evidence was too absolute and his crimes were too severe. 6 months later, a federal judge sentenced Jamal to 15 years in a high-security federal penitentiary for wire fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. The smooth-talking, arrogant lawyer was reduced to a federal inmate number, stripped of his tailored suits and his fabricated power. Brittany's downfall was a spectacular, agonizing descent into the exact kind of poverty she had always mocked. The federal government immediately froze all of her joint bank accounts. The massive luxury house she lived in was seized by the bank. Federal agents arrived at her driveway and towed away her brand-new, fully loaded Porsche. They confiscated her designer handbags, her expensive jewelry, and her inherited artwork, classifying all of it as property purchased with stolen corporate funds. She reached out to her wealthy country club friends, begging for loans and a place to stay, but the social exile was absolute. No one wanted to be associated with the wife of a convicted federal embezzler. The golden child was completely ostracized. Forced to face the real world for the first time in her 31 years of life, Brittany had to file for absolute bankruptcy. She ended up moving into a tiny, damp apartment on the outskirts of the city, forced to take a minimum-wage retail job just to afford her groceries. She spent her days folding clothes for strangers, entirely stripped of the unearned luxury she had built her entire arrogant identity upon. Richard and Patricia faced their own catastrophic ruin. The commercial bank pursued the felony forgery charges with aggressive, relentless fury. To avoid serving time in a state prison at their advanced age, my parents were forced to accept a brutal plea deal. They received 5 years of strict probation, but the financial penalties completely annihilated them. The court ordered massive restitution payments to cover the legal damages they had caused. Their pristine, manicured suburban home, the exact house where they had abandoned me with a single $100 bill, was foreclosed on by the bank. It was auctioned off to the highest bidder. My parents lost their retirement funds, their savings, and their pristine social standing. The people they used to host at their fancy dinner parties now crossed the street to avoid speaking to them. They were forced to pack whatever meager belongings they had left and move into a subsidized senior living facility, living out their final years in the exact kind of absolute isolation they had subjected me to as a child. They had tried to execute a hostile takeover of my life. Instead, they had unknowingly signed their own financial and social death warrants. The justice was cold, it was absolute, and it was perfectly executed. I woke up the next morning just before sunrise. For the first time in my entire life, I did not wake up with that familiar heavy knot of anxiety sitting at the base of my throat. The estate was completely silent, but it was not the terrifying, empty silence of that freezing house from 21 years ago. It was the warm, heavy silence of absolute safety. I wrapped myself in a thick cashmere robe and walked barefoot across the imported marble floors. The broken glass from the coffee table had been completely swept away by my staff before I even woke up, leaving no physical trace of the violent chaos that had erupted the night before. I went into my massive gourmet kitchen and brewed a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. I stood at the marble island, the exact kind of island where my parents had once left that single crisp $100 bill. I thought about that piece of paper for a long moment. When I was a starving 13-year-old girl, I looked at that money and saw my own worthlessness. I saw the physical proof that I was only worth $100 to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. But standing in my own multi-million-dollar kitchen, sipping expensive coffee, I realized that the $100 bill was actually the greatest gift they could have ever given me. It forced me to stop relying on them. It forced me to build my own armor. I carried my coffee mug out through the heavy glass doors and stepped onto my expansive private balcony. The crisp autumn air bit at my cheeks, but the rising sun was already beginning to warm the stone beneath my feet. I looked out over the Long Island Sound, watching the golden morning light shatter across the gentle ocean waves. The view was breathtaking, but the true beauty of the moment was the profound, absolute freedom expanding inside my chest. My phone buzzed gently in the pocket of my robe. It was a text message from my lead corporate attorney. He was simply confirming that the federal agents had successfully secured all of Jamal's servers and that the local district attorney had formally denied bail for my parents due to their severe flight risk and the magnitude of the financial fraud. I read the message and calmly locked my screen. There was no panic. There was no sudden urge to call the precinct and post their bail. For the first time in my life, I allowed them to face the absolute unshielded consequences of their own actions. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took another sip of my coffee. For decades, I had carried the invisible weight of their expectations and their constant quiet cruelty. I had spent so much of my youth trying to figure out how to be good enough for a mother who saw me as an inconvenience and a father who saw me as an ATM. I had watched my sister Brittany receive endless praise for simply existing while I had to claw my way up a mountain just to be tolerated. But the events of last night had completely severed those toxic roots. When Captain Donovan marched them out of my front doors in handcuffs, he did not just arrest 4 criminals. He permanently evicted the ghosts that had been haunting my mind. I took a slow, deep breath of the salt-tinged air, feeling the final lingering traces of guilt wash away. Society places such a massive, suffocating emphasis on the concept of blood relatives. We are conditioned from birth to believe that family is sacred, and that we must endlessly forgive the people who share our DNA, regardless of how terribly they treat us. We are told to keep the peace, to swallow our trauma, and to protect the family reputation at all costs. But blood is not a license for abuse. Sharing a last name does not give anyone the right to tear down your self-worth, steal your peace, or orchestrate a hostile takeover of your life. People often ask me if I will ever forgive them. They say holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. But I am not angry anymore. Anger requires emotional investment, and I have absolutely zero emotional currency left to spend on Richard, Patricia, Brittany, or Jamal. I do not need to forgive them to find peace. I just needed to remove them. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but it is not a mandatory requirement for healing. Sometimes the healthiest, most empowering thing you can do is simply walk away, lock the door, and throw away the key. My real family was not sitting in a federal holding cell waiting to be processed. My real family was David, my brilliant chief technology officer who stood beside me when the police tasers were drawn. My real family was Carter, the security specialist who risked his own safety to physically pull my abusive father away from me. My real family consisted of the people who celebrated my victories without envy and protected my boundaries without question. I had spent so much time mourning the parents and the sister I never had that I almost failed to appreciate the beautiful, loyal tribe I had actively chosen for myself. The cybersecurity firm I had built from nothing was entering a massive new chapter. The acquisition by the global defense contractor was finalized, and my financial future was secured for the rest of my life. I had the resources to travel the world to invest in other young female entrepreneurs who were starting from the bottom and to live every single day exactly on my own terms. I did not have to look over my shoulder anymore. Jamal was facing federal prison. Brittany was facing total bankruptcy and social exile. Richard and Patricia were facing the complete collapse of their fabricated upper-class reality. I did not have to waste another second of my life worrying about their next manipulative scheme. The fortress I had built was truly impenetrable. I leaned against the sturdy glass railing of my balcony, letting the morning sun warm my face. I thought about the terrified, freezing little girl hiding in her bedroom closet 21 years ago. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her that she was going to survive. I wished I could show her the view from this balcony and tell her that the pain was temporary, but the strength she was building would last forever. But I knew she was already a part of me. Every single brick of this estate was mortared with her resilience. Every successful business deal I ever closed was fueled by her sheer will to live. She did not just survive the darkness they left her in, she used it to build a brilliantly illuminated life. The shadows of my past were permanently, entirely erased. I took one final deep breath of the morning air, feeling completely whole and unapologetically alive. They thought leaving me with nothing would break me. Instead, it taught me exactly how to build an empire they could never touch. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, but occasionally you have to pack it up and hand it to the police yourself. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family to protect your peace? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe.